Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeTheWedge.com. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest as the only Jewish child in my public school classes. And then in a Jewish community in which there were not Holocaust survivors, our parents and grandparents came around 1900 or a few years afterwards. And then in 1970, a US Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, only 25 years after the end of World War II. It changed our lives forever.
At this meaningful time of the year, when we commemorate the Holocaust on Yom HaShoah and celebrate the defeat of the Nazis on VE Day, we are extremely thrilled to have as our guest one of America's most important thought leaders on anti-Semitism and on preserving our liberal society, Bari Weiss. Bari Weiss is a journalist and author. She's the editor of the newsletter Common Sense, which you can find at www.bariweiss.substack.com. She's also the host of the podcast Honestly. Her newsletter and podcast cover facts and opinions that are mostly discussed behind closed doors these days, because they don't fit the woke narrative. From 2017 to 2020, Bari was an opinion writer and editor at the New York Times. Before that, she was an op-ed editor and book review editor at the Wall Street Journal. For 2 years, she was a senior editor at Tablet, the online magazine of Jewish news, politics, and culture. She regularly appears on shows such as The View, Morning Joe, and Real Time with Bill Maher. Bari is a proud Pittsburgh native and a graduate of Columbia University. In 2019, she wrote the book How to Fight Anti-Semitism that won the National Jewish Book Award. Last year, Bari was the recipient of the Daniel Pearl Award for Courage and Integrity in Journalism. Welcome, Bari, on our show. We're super thrilled to have you on.
I'm so excited to be here, Phyllis. I'm thrilled to meet you, and I'll show up whenever Evelyn asks me to anything. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I get to ask the first question. Is there something in your personal background motivated you to write your book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism?
Yes, I would say the most immediate answer to that question was what happened on the morning of October 2019, when a neo-Nazi white supremacist named Robert Bowers walked into Tree of Life, the synagogue where I had become a bat mitzvah, and shot 11 Jews dead in the midst of prayer. And it was the most lethal attack on Jews in American history. I'm sure that anyone who listens to this podcast is deeply familiar with it. The context, though, kind of leading up to that, was that, and I'm so curious, Phyllis, what your experience was like growing up in the Midwestern place that you referenced. But I grew up very, very much in what I now understand was a kind of 20th century shtetl. In other words, it was the kind of place where we all sort of knew each other. It was unlike New York or LA, as wonderful as those cities are, where we weren't sort of constrained to our political or religious denominational lane. You know, it was very normal for all of us to think of ourselves as one Jewish community, which was incredibly special. And most importantly and significantly, and this is what I fear has begun to shift, there was nothing about my Jewish identity, my Zionism, that felt in any way under threat or in contradiction to being fully and completely accepted as an American. So even when certain things happen to me, like someone saying to pick up pennies or the Catholic school bus driving by and shouting at me and my sisters, kikes and dirty Jews, it didn't at all penetrate me, completely washed off my back. And it was because of the confidence, really, that I was raised with, which is to say, I was raised to believe that America was far and away the departure from Jewish history, right? It was the most exceptional diaspora experience in thousands of years. And the reason for that was because of the ideals and the sort of bedrock foundational virtues on which this country was founded, right? It wasn't by coincidence that American Jews felt welcome, that the Jews would feel welcome in a place that the founders said was the New Jerusalem, that the Jews would feel safe in a place where Benjamin Franklin wanted the image on the Great Seal to be Moses crossing the Red Sea, where Abraham Lincoln called Americans the almost chosen people because he knew who the real chosen people were. In other words, Jewish values, I was led to believe, and my Jewish identity were completely harmonious with American values and my American identity. What began to shift for me that horrible morning in October was a little bit of shakiness about what I had previously taken for granted. All of a sudden, I found myself asking questions about, well, what happens in a country that moves away from those kind of founding ideals? What happens in a country in which, as my former colleague Brett Stevens has put it, the moral guardrails that keep bigotry at bay are dismantled? What happens in a country in which the political center begins to collapse and political extremes rise? What happens in a country going through unbelievable technological and economic change where there is an enormous gap between the have and have-nots? Well, we're starting to see what that looks like. The beginning of that change, at least for me, for others, I'm sure it was a different moment, depending on your lives and your location and how you live. But for me, that morning was sort of the beginning of the waking up of my holiday from history. And then, of course, you have 6 months later to the day, the attack on Poway here in California. A shooter entered the Chabad there. And then you have, of course, the machete attack in upstate New York, in Muncie, in a scene straight out of sort of 19th century Eastern Europe. Then you have the attack on the kosher supermarket in Jersey City, on the boulevard named for Martin Luther King Jr. And then, of course, you have the rolling attacks against the most visible members of the Jewish community, the Haredi Jewish community in Brooklyn, in places like Crown Heights and Borough Park. And then, of course, you have the sort of institutionalized anti-Semitism of the far left that is making many Jewish students on campus, for example, begin to closet their Judaism and their Zionism. All of those things conspired to make me write this book. I will say I was under contract to do another one, which I'm still on the hook for, but these questions sort of became like a drumbeat in my mind and in my heart. They became unavoidable. And I wanted to write the book first and foremost selfishly, to understand the nature of anti-Semitism, to understand why the sort of post-war years had been so unbelievably blessed, overall for
Yes.
American Jews, and what it was that was changing and how we might fight back against those changes.
Thank you very much for that explanation. And Evelyn, why don't you ask the next question?
So when I immigrated from Europe to the United States in 2006, there wasn't so much anti-Semitism in America then. And now we see it's rising every year. So how come? What changed in America that causes this?
Well, there are the buzzwords that everyone will point to, some of which I already named: tribalization, polarization, a sense of people feeling left behind and wanting to point a finger. And oftentimes when that finger is pointed, it ends up landing on the Jew. So those things are patterns we've seen before throughout Jewish history. But I think, without sounding too high-minded, that when I really go deep, okay, all of those things are happening, all of those things have happened before in other times and places. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jew hate is on the rise. But there is something, there's a kind of war on a certain set of ideas right now in America that I think have made Jews, not just Jews, safe and secure, but have allowed America to be a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, liberal democracy with success beyond imagining, right? So what are those ideas? They're ideas that a generation ago were taken for granted, like gravity and oxygen, right? The idea that people are created in the image of God, every single one of us, and therefore we're all entitled to equality under the law. It's a set of beliefs that prizes the sacredness of the individual over the group. It's a set of ideas that says we judge a person based on their deed and not based on the circumstances of their birth, not based on their lineage, not based on their color, not based on the sins or the virtues of their parents. It's a worldview that says due process and the presumption of innocence are good and mob justice is bad. It's a set of ideas that says fairness is about equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And of course, it's an ideology, a worldview that says there is such thing as truth, and there is something else, and that is a lie. And it should, like, there's a reason that Jews and really any one of difference thrives in a society where those ideas are considered true and virtuous, right? The problem is that we are now seeing those ideas that I just laid out for you as threats, right? Instead of due process, we have mob justice. Instead of equality of opportunity, which is something that civil rights leaders fought so hard for, we have an ideology that suggests that anything less than total equality of outcome is the true measure of fairness. And as Ibram Kendi, the author of How to Be a Racist, says, any disparity between groups is proof that there is systemic racism, right? Instead of the idea of prizing the individual over the group, we prize the group. Instead of saying we should judge everyone on their merits, we say, no, we need to judge people according to the lane of their birth. In fact, we go further. We say some people are born to be oppressed, some people are born to be oppressors, and that's just the way it is, right? Where liberty and freedom thrive, where difference is dignified and celebrated, Jews are. But in a culture increasingly as ours is, especially in elite spaces, where freedom of thought and faith and speech are under siege, Jews tend to be too. So that's what's going on big picture. Now, of course, there's the ideology from the far right, which is the kind of mirror image of that says certain people are born to be rulers and certain people are born to be ruled. Certain people are born to be at the top of the hierarchy and others are born to be subhuman. The only reason I don't feel the need to go into that in depth is we know it.
Yeah.
This is a podcast about anti-Semitism. Evelyn is the daughter of people that survived that ideology. And it's morally easy to see that ideology and to call it out. I think the other one is much more difficult, which is why, I devote a lot of my book and a lot of my time speaking to the one that I think has been smuggled in to mainstream society under the guise of righteousness, but in fact is deeply insidious, is deeply dangerous, and is really, really bad for Jews.
It's bad for Jews because they are seen as the oppressors, I guess.
Right.
In that ideology, and the privileged because there's no equality of outcome with them on average, with other groups. But you said there was this opportunity, this equality of opportunity for everybody as the central idea for America. But how about slavery? that was not equal opportunity, right?
You are completely right. But the thing, and this is really, really important, when you look back to leaders like Martin Luther King, right? He didn't say, because the Enlightenment was created by dead white men who were bigoted in any number of ways, we need to repudiate the Enlightenment. He did not say, because the founders, the men, and they were all men that wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, were slave owners, because many of them are, then we need to repudiate and throw out the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He said, no, it's a promissory note. It's a promissory note. And we are coming to Washington, he said, to cash the check. And that's the key to America, right? America has, it's not just the original sin of slavery, right? I mean, think back, I'm doing research for an episode about gay rights. And I was watching Ellen on Oprah and the context in 1997 when she came out. To think about the amount of progress this country's made on that issue in under 4 decades is astonishing. So no, I'm not sitting here trying to whitewash American history or to claim there was always equality of outcome. Absolutely not. I'm saying, though, that the way that we expanded the American dream was by insisting that the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are intended for every single American, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation. And that's the secret sauce, right? What this ideology does that is so dangerous is that it insists that because the identities and the behavior of the people that created these world transforming ideas and this world transforming country were flawed, then we have to throw the whole thing out.
Yeah.
It says that things, not that, like, it doesn't say slavery is the result of white supremacy. Jim Crow is the result of white supremacy. Redlining is the result of white supremacy, which they all are. It says reason, hard work, merit, that those are the result of white supremacy. And that really is an assault on the core things that have made America America and that have made the West the safest, best place for Jews, for women, for gay people, and for every other minority group.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Phyllis.
Yes. This is really connected to what you just talked about, because you speak up a lot against critical race theory, also called CRT or woke. Woke is now the dominant intellectual movement in most American culture institutions, schools, corporations, and governments. Can you briefly describe critical race theory, or CRT or woke, to us? What your main criticism about critical race theory is, and how woke affects Jews?
Wow. Yeah. Well, in 2 minutes. Well, when I'm talking about critical race theory, of course, I'm using that as shorthand. I'm not talking about the ideas of Derek Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw and all of the other texts that are read in places like PhD programs in law schools. I'm not judging those set of ideas. I'm judging the outcome of those ideas in the real world and how they play themselves out. So in this worldview, here's what it actually looks like. It looks like a kind of Manichaean black and white thinking in which everyone is slotted into either racist, as Ibram Kendi says, or anti-racist. Well, anti-racist sounds great. Who wouldn't want to be anti-racist, right? But what if I told you that to be a good anti-racist, as he believes, you have to be anti-capitalist? This is what he said. The life of racism cannot be separated from the life of capitalism. In order to truly be anti-racist, you also have to be anti-capitalist. What about if I told you that to be a good anti-racist, you had to believe in discrimination right now? As Kendi puts it, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future generation discrimination. So we're caught in an endless cycle of discrimination by choice. To be an anti-racist in the worldview of Ibram Kendi, and this is the dominant view when people are talking about anti-racism. He says to be an anti-racist is to see all cultures in their differences as on the same level, as equals. When we see cultural difference, we are seeing cultural difference, nothing more, nothing less. Does anyone actually believe that a society that practices female genital mutilation, that hangs gay people from cranes, that forces women into burqas, that doesn't allow them to have their own bank account, is equal to a liberal democracy? I do not. It says nothing about what I view about people's inherent equality and dignity, but all cultures are not created equal. So I think a lot of people, when they hear the phrase anti-racism, think, sign me up, because who wouldn't? When you hear social justice, sign me up, who wouldn't? When you hear equity, sign me up, who wouldn't? The problem is that under the guise of these wonderful utopian sounding ideas, they're smuggling in something that is profoundly anti-liberal. So what critical race theory comes along and does is that it says all of the systems that uphold our culture are infected with systemic racism and white supremacy. It says there's no such thing as neutrality, even in the law. And that the very notion of colorblindness, right, is itself racist. It says that racism, it fundamentally changes the definition. It is not about discrimination. It is about power plus discrimination. In other words, there is no such thing as, let's say, a Black person being racist, because in this view of the world, they don't have the power. It also says that racism is about disparate outcomes, right? Not about equality of opportunity. In other words, if everyone, according to Kendi, doesn't finish the race at the same time, the course must be flawed and it needs to be dismantled. That is the reason for getting rid of the SAT. It's the reason for getting rid of elite public schools like Lowell in San Francisco and Stuyvesant in New York, because there were too many Asians outperforming on the test, right? Or this explains the argument that was made unbelievably in the New York Times by the classical music critic there, saying that we need to do away with colorblind auditions, right? And it goes further than that. According to this view of the world, it says politeness, is sort of a vestige of white supremacy, right? It's my favorite example of all of this is the KIPP Charter School Network, okay? Had this famous motto. It was work hard, be nice. Work hard, be nice. Who wouldn't want that for their kid? KIPP got rid of the phrase work hard. Why? Because, and this is a quote, it supports the illusion of meritocracy. Now, why does all of this redound to being bad for Jews? The best answer for this comes from an incredible young man called Blake Flayton, who read my book, wrote me an email, then ended up writing a piece for the New York Times, and now runs an organization called the New Zionist Congress and is making aliyah.
We interviewed him a few weeks ago.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So here's what he wrote me about this. It's hard to overstate how suffocating this worldview is for Jewish college students. We don't fit in to oppressor or oppressed categories. We're both privileged and marginalized, protected by those in power, yet targeted by the same racist lunatics that target people of color. The hatred we experience on campus has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is because Jews defy anti-racist ideology simply by existing. So it's not so much, he says, that Zionism is racism. It's that Jewishness is. In other words, Jews who refuse to erase what makes us different and complicated and unable to be slotted into these black and white categories are thrown in with the white privileged oppressor apologist for imperialism and colonialism bucket. And that is frankly why we see so many young Jews who are caught between their Jewish identity and their love for the state of Israel and a progressive culture that increasingly says to them, choose. If you want to be part of our group, if you want to sit at the cool kids table, if you want to be on the right side of history, you can do it. You just have to disavow those things.
You have to disavow Israel? Or
you have to disavow Israel, and you have to disavow Jewish power itself.
Right. And that brings me to my next question, which what I observed in Europe is that Jews who tend to sympathize with the intersectional alliance and all that, they feel even another element that is how do you say clashing with the ideology they sympathize with. As Jews, it clashes because they say and they're starting a debate now in the media, and they start to write articles about it. The whole notion that Jews belong to the white and privileged and to the oppressors in society and not to the oppressed. So, for instance, the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam recently organized an exhibition titled "Are Jews White?"
What was the answer?
Because they want to stimulate the debate, and so they present one argument which says the woke movement says Jews are white and privileged because Jews are not recognizable by their skin color and therefore are not singled out by the police. But European Jews who debate this say Jews have been killed and excluded throughout our history as a minority in Europe. This is different from America, right? This is interesting. The Nazis wiped out our families and community because they considered them not white, because they were of the wrong race. How white and privileged can you call a minority of which 2 out of 3 people were killed a generation ago because they weren't considered white? So, who suffered because they weren't considered white? And today, Jews still get attacked in the streets and schools of Europe. So this is a different situation than most Jews have, a different background than most Jews today have in America, right? So the whole experience of the Holocaust, the wiping out of the community then and still being attacked in the streets and schools of Europe is, and in a bigger amount even than in America, is clashing with the notion we are white and privileged.
So are Jews in cities like Amsterdam pushing back against it? Liberal
They start
Jews?
to write articles. They start to they organize an exhibition about it to stimulate the debate, because there was no debate possible about Jews being white and privileged and oppressing, right? It was a known fact, right? So my question to you is, if you hear the European dynamics around Jewish whiteness, do you agree with which argument do you agree, or do you have additional perspectives on Jews being white or not white?
I am so turned off, I have to say, by the things that I see, at least in liberal Jewish communities in America, of basically the way that they are being subsumed by this sort of like radical chic belief of separating Jews within a community. We have white Jews, we have Jews of color. No, guys, Jews predate this whole notion of race. What are we talking about? Jews are Jews. And I find this sort of dividing up inside of the community really uncomfortable and not Jewish, frankly. It really undermines the notion of one Jewish people, of Am Yisrael. And, the idea of Jews being white, just go to Israel. Tell me again that Jews are white. What I will say, though, is can Ashkenazi American Jews pass more easily than other minorities of color? Of course, right? Of course. And the answer will be Natalie Portman changing her name, or Jon Stewart changing his, or Ralph Lifshitz, one of my favorite examples, changing it to Ralph Lauren and becoming one of the most successful, famous designers. So yeah, is that possible? Of course. But the idea that because Jews are able to achieve incredible success in liberal supposedly open societies and that protects them. All we need to do is think about the Jews of Germany to see where that argument ends up. So, the notion, as I heard the other day, it's really about like when our difference is erased by this ideology and it says you're just white people like everyone else, a lot of things follow from that, right? When that is the assumption, then, and this was a real example, a book published by a major publishing house that literally argued that Jewish businesses could be looted because Jews are the face of capital, or the idea that Zionism is nothing but white European settler colonialism, or the idea that, literally, this is a real example, describing the Holocaust as white on white crime, right? Or the statement that Whoopi Goldberg made the other day, which, by the way, was not made, I don't think at all, with malicious intent in her heart.
No.
She was merely repeating what has become normal, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And that in itself is terrible, but it's also, it sounds to me also very America-centric. It gives me the idea that woke has been established in America, it has been developed in America, and that it's didn't look very much further than America.
Well, you tell me. It seems to me like woke is an American export at this point.
Yeah,
Is it?
it is.
Yeah. I mean,
It is. Yeah,
just
and
want-
it is. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing here. Americans are really very narrow. They really don't understand a history beyond our own shores very well. I mean, all the research I do when writing about the Holocaust, and as Evelyn pointed out, almost my play and my project is understood much better in Europe than it is in the United States. Why? Because in Europe, almost everyone who's alive today has lost family members through the Holocaust. And here in America, that percentage is not of Jews is not nearly as much. So they don't realize the risk that anti-Semitism is to them in the United States, and they realize it much more in Europe. And so that's one of the things that our show is trying to do, is to bring listeners to understand, yeah, it can happen here if you don't speak up.
well, one of the things that Evelyn has, that we've talked about in real life is your sense that you know what's about to play out here because you've seen this movie before.
What it is?
And I'm not referring there to the Holocaust. I'm referring to, the reasons that you left Amsterdam.
Yeah. What made me leave Amsterdam? Is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, meaning like you have said, I've seen, like you've literally said to me, American Jews have no idea what's coming.
Yeah.
I have seen what's going to happen.
Right.
So I'd love for you to tell me, as
Okay.
someone who is more of an expert, what is going to happen?
Okay, so what I have seen in the 70s when I started to go to college is that my country Holland was pretty much pro-Israel whenever Israel was fighting a war. And when I went to college at the end of the 70s, it was a totally different environment. It was totally pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, and Israel was demonized. But that was in college, right? And nowhere else. But then I saw that in a few years, that went from universities to cultural elites, to the media, to the mainstream population. So if you ask Europeans today, would it be better for the world if Israel would be abolished? More than half say yes, that would be good for the world. And it started in college. Today, I see it big time in America in college. That wasn't the case when I immigrated here 15 years ago. It goes fast. So what you can expect, and you already see, is that from college, it went to the cultural elite. It's going to the media, it's going to the mainstream media even. And it will go from there to the general population and social media these days. So I expect the same um, the same development in that respect. I also experienced in Europe um, a lot of Muslim immigration, where in the Muslim population in the world, anti-Semitism is 2 to 4 times higher than in any other population. So suddenly I live in a city, Amsterdam, where almost half of the population is Muslim and heavily anti-Semitic. So suddenly I experience physical aggression in the streets of Amsterdam and Paris and Brussels and Berlin. And that is different in America. In America, you have less Muslim immigration. It's not as big a proportion of the population as it is in Europe. But we do see in many mosques around America that whenever there is a flare-up of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there is in a lot of those mosques, there is a call to annihilate the Jews. So it's not zero in America, the Muslim anti-Semitism. It's not as much as in Europe, but it's not zero either. And we see a growth of the Muslim population proportion in America. And so if we don't manage the anti-Semitism that is inherent in Muslim populations around the globe, also in America, if we don't manage that, then anti-Semitism will also rise coming from that group.
But what do you say to the argument that America is just fundamentally different than Europe? People, especially as, you know, as families are here for longer, as immigration sort of fades into the background, they just give up a lot of those extreme viewpoints and they assimilate into capitalism, into, you know, the good life, and on and on and on. And there's not the same ghettoization that exists in a lot of European cities. Do you buy that?
Can I say something, not about Europe, but just about, we live in Los Angeles, the three of us, right? And there's New York and there's Chicago and stuff. But when you live in other areas, and for example, when my husband and I were in the military, this is why I'm so thrilled about talking tomorrow to the military. There are so many people in America who have never met Jews, that they are willing to believe almost anything, not out of maliciousness, because literally they don't know the difference. So we three are in very privileged, and I use that word understanding what it means, situations. And we forget many times about the rest of America. The flyover.
I understand what you're saying. People don't know Jews, so they believe easily all kinds of false accusations about Jews. But we also know from history in Berlin in the 30s, the Germans knew the Jews very well, and still non-Jewish friends of Jewish families turned against them. So knowing each other is not a guarantee. The role of ideology is big. So in America, you have the ideology of the white supremacists, and I've never come across it where I lived in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, and in LA. But friends tell me it's there, and what exactly the numbers are, I don't know. But okay, the ideology of white supremacy is dangerous for Jews and its existence in America. In my view, the whole Western world experiences a lot of immigration that is not controlled. The whole world is migrating and it's not under control. So we see receiving countries turn more nationalist and wanting to protect their Western traditional culture, which you could call not white supremacist, but certainly white Protestant in many cases, or white Catholic in many cases, Christian. And so I think with a lot of uncontrolled immigration in the United States, you'll get more white supremacists who come in the fringe of, in my view, a healthy defense of the original culture. Um,
Hmm.
and we see that in every Western and liberal country happening, whether it's Sweden or Holland or
Sweet.
England. So I expect white
But then
supremacy.
that's also not good. I mean, like, I don't view, let's just take France as an example, right? You could argue that the reason for the rise of Le Pen or Zemmour, even though Macron won, is that. But that they're also not good for
No,
the
but
Jews.
if we don't control migration, if we just keep the door open and don't care how many people come in, then you can expect the rise of the Le Pens of this world.
Hmm.
So I think in order to stop the Le Pens of this world and their rise, we have to better control immigration. I'm not saying stopping it, but at least manage it.
Mm.
And the other ideology in woke ideology,
Yes.
it's no longer that people look at Jews for who they really are. Even if they know them, they tend to follow the ideology that is fed to them.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in the Soviet Union. We've seen it in Nazi Germany. Ideology can make people blind for facts.
Exactly. That's
And
what happened in Nazi
I
Germany.
could easily see that in the young generation of Americans already happening, actually, not only towards Jews, but facts are no longer valued very much, right? Empirical facts are no longer very important, right? In telling what is the truth. So white supremacy could rise in America if immigration is not regulated or managed. Woke ideology, anti-Semitic, could rise in America for obvious reasons, and Islamist anti-Semitism could also rise in America, because we're not doing a lot in America against the position of Islamist groups. Instead of giving a podium and listening to Muslim reformers, for instance, we do tend to dialogue and listen and give influence to groups and get the advice, even at government level, from groups who are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, who are super Orthodox Muslims, who are not into an equality of individuals. So if we let that influence grow, that could also be a factor in America that makes it more difficult for Jews, in my opinion.
As we come to the end of our time, and we could go on for another hour, are there things that, Evelyn, is there something that you want to say? But can we let Bari say anything addition that she really wants to say to kind of wrap up this conversation? I mean, there are other questions we're going to ask, but we've had such a good conversation that we didn't get to them. We'll invite you back.
Okay, great.
But is there something you'd like to say now that you feel that we haven't, really talked about enough?
Only that there's a lot of things to be worried about. And obviously, you guys are doing a podcast themed around anti-Semitism. So there's a lot that you focus on that's bad. And I'm grateful for that. I guess what I would say is I feel also very optimistic right now. And maybe that's delusional. But the optimism is coming from the fact that I do see more and more people coming out and standing up and being courageous and sort of being like, I guess, Queen Esther in our moment. And I think that, if anyone's watching this and you're wondering if it would make a difference if you spoke out in your school or on your campus or in the institution where you work or on the Slack channel or on wherever it is, I really believe that the answer is yes. And I believe that one of the lessons of Jewish history is that small groups of people, often from the fringes of Jewish life, can transform our trajectory. And
100% believe.
excuse me. And so that's what I would say is I think, especially we're talking today on Yom HaShoah, and I just think now is the time. Like we are at a very pivotal moment. We are at maybe a hinge moment, even in history, maybe in American history, maybe beyond that. And don't wait. Now is the time to out yourself and speak up.
And you, Barry, are such an inspiration for all of us to do so.
Absolutely. That's
Thank
a
you.
wonderful closing statement. We thank you so much, Barry, for coming on our show. We thank our listeners. I want to encourage everyone who hasn't seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, to see it on Amazon or YouTube. People can learn more about my nonfiction Holocaust theater project at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we end every show by saying, without putting yourself in physical danger, please speak up against anti-Semitism whenever you can.